I can confidently say that Esther is one of my favorite books. I have read it multiple times. As a kid, I read it over and over, and at the time, I definitely read it as a fairy tale. I think my one strength as a child and a teen was that I was an avid bookworm with a borderline maladaptive imagination. The palace I pictured in my head was not accurate, but it was definitely shiny and sparkly. And then I also understood the irony and the satire found in the story. So that definitely fueled my love for this book. I grew to love Mordecai and I especially loved Esther. And as a girl, I think it's just natural for me to love her. That being said, as a kid, I had no knowledge of exegesis, hermeneutics, context, etc. So when I got to the end of chapter 2, where it says that King Ahasuerus, and I might be saying that wrong, loved Esther more than any of the other women, I took that literally, and I know better now. I know that this is not a fairy tale. So that's just a little background about me and the story, but I just want to discuss what stood out to me while I revisit the story. Chapter 1. One of the biggest themes in this book is God's providence. Many times in our lives, we wonder why things happen. We pray and we wonder when God will answer. And the truth is that God's plans are good. This is true in our lives, and it's true throughout the Bible as well as the story. And so the first 8 verses of the story set the scene. We're introduced to King Ahasuerus, who is the king of Persia. We get this little detail that he was the king of 127 provinces, which may have been to clarify and differentiate from a different Babylonian king with the same name who had a smaller empire. And this is an interesting kind of detail. If this had been a manuscript written by ancient Persians, I almost would have thought that it was a flex. But you'll quickly see that no, there's no flattery to King Ahasuerus. So his empire was huge. He decides to hold a huge feast for his officials, his servants, his army, his nobles, his governors. Those are all listed in the text. And then the party is described with all these wonderful details in verses 6 to 7. And I'll try to read it as best I can. There were white cotton curtains, violet hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rods, and marble pillars. Drinks are served in golden vessels, royal wine, according to the bounty of the king, right? So it's all very grand and great. One subject that I would like to explore more thoroughly in the Bible, which I haven't had a chance to do so yet, is the connection between beauty and other things in the Bible. Intuitively, I have noticed that this is often associated with grace, and when women or men are described in the Bible as beautiful or handsome, it's also described as like a blessing. So I'd like to do maybe further research in the future about what that means. And then I just can't help it but like I often associate beauty with the superficial. You know, we have expressions like don't judge a book by its cover, that sort of thing. I am reminded of the story of David, right? When he was gonna be chosen by Samuel, right? Samuel looked at all his brothers first, and God said, look at the heart. There's also a ton of research that suggests that people's eyes and attention linger on those they consider attractive. There's also a link between good looks being associated with good health, right? So beauty is like this very complex thing, and those are like some initial things that I'm throwing around. But yeah, I'd like to explore that more in the future. But something that I liked about this, one of the notes I wrote from one of my resources points out the juxtaposition between the grand splendor of the king's court compared to their debauchery and other terrible behavior. It reminds me of the quote, all that glitters is not gold, right? On the surface, everything seemed great. The palace was splendid and wonderful, but, the people inside were not necessarily like that. And then in verse 8, it says, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. And this echoes in my mind what's written in Judges. I was instantly reminded of that in Judges 21, verse 25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. What I think is interesting is that in Judges, the people's wickedness came from not submitting to any authority, whether earthly or heavenly. And this is terrible because God should have been their king, right? That's the whole thing with Judges. But then in Esther, I feel like there's like a slight, difference, and in my opinion, like a step further into this. there is an earthly king. There is an earthly king, right? And he's powerful. He has a whole empire. He has authority, power, right? But then he encourages the people to do these wicked things. So there's that. And then I started thinking about Queen Vashti. Like, you can't help but think about that. I remember as a kid, I was very worried about what happened to her. And the Bible doesn't say, but I just keep thinking about how she had every right to decline the king's request, right? Because we believe that all humans should have the right to autonomy, control over their own bodies, decisions, life, like how that is expressed, like in complex issues, you know, that's a whole different thing. But like the principle we all can agree with. Sometimes something I would not have known without my resources is that Queen Vashti was also in the right from their own culture's perspective, right? Because sometimes we read the Bible with our context in mind. But what they would have agreed in their culture, it can be highlighted in verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the woman in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. It was normal, according to my resources, for women to have separate spaces from men, like across ranks. And so agreeing to the king's request would have just been bizarre. Like, that's not, women did not go to the men's feasts. I mean, it would have also been unwise. Like, why would she subject herself to the eyes of like drunk men? There's no win-win situation here for Queen Vashti. And unfortunately, I think you could also see that at the end of verse 9. It says, in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus, right? So it's clear from the beginning that Queen Vashti had no control, no power, no chance of being spared from the king's anger and foolishness. What is clear to me, having read this story several times, is that you think about what happened to Queen Vashti and you think, you know, she obviously had no power, no control, as I just said, and now she's going to be gone, and now another woman's going to take her place. And we all, if you've read the story, right, you know Esther is going to find herself in that same situation, right? Or at least that's kind of how the logic feels like it should flow, that she'd be powerless and at the mercy of a foolish king. But I think the clear difference here is that Esther had faith, right? She was Jewish, she believed in the King of Kings, Lord of Lords, and it just made me think that, like, although there may be sometimes moments where maybe there's people with more influence or power over us, and maybe we feel trapped and limited by our circumstances, we serve a sovereign king, and his will ultimately prevails, right? And if we believe in that sincerely, and if we have faith, we can find freedom and assurance in that. And honestly, that can't be taken away. This is true for us, and it was true for Esther. So no matter how great King Ahasuerus was, and how many provinces he had, and how big his empire was, it, one, does not compare to the sovereignty of God. But two, there's so much that you can control, and ultimately you can't control what's in the hearts of people. And in turn, you couldn't control what was inside Esther. So one scholar points out that the king's advisors were worried that the word would get out about Vashti's disobedience, and I had to include this because I thought it was funny and ironic. So they decided to make this ridiculous decree, right? All women should give honor to their husbands. That's what it says, and this is ridiculous for several reasons, and it was pointed out to me in the resources. Well, one, surely there was more pressing matters, right? More important things to do. But secondly, this was already something practiced in their culture, so it's just redundant. Thirdly, they had this printed in many languages, which, according to what I read, would have been very costly. Another detail was that they like made the extra effort to like put it in more places than they usually would have, which again would have been costly, and it's like that's where the people's taxes are going, I guess. And then finally, by doing this, they would make sure that everyone in the empire found out what happened. Like, now people are really gonna know. So it's just all ridiculous and funny and ironic. But anyways, that's the foolishness, and it's going to contrast with what we see in chapter 2. So I'm gonna kind of work my way backwards. At the end of the chapter, verses 19 to 23, we get this short paragraph that sets up a few key things. One, establishes that Esther's gonna hide her identity, and this will set it up so that she can reveal it at the right time. One of the commentators wrote that this reminded them of Joseph. Joseph was kind of hidden, forgotten about, exile until the opportune time. And then the second thing, Mordecai then discovers a plot against the king, and he tells Esther, who in turn tells the king. And then when it's investigated and confirmed, the king now associates both Mordecai and Esther with loyalty and trust. And then this whole thing is a chiasm, which I'll go into detail later, not in this video, but maybe at a later time. So it's just great. We're setting up some key things here. And then in the Bible, we see that there's a pattern. This is just a note for myself for the future. There's a pattern of God's children submitting to ruling authorities, and I would really like to explore this further. I'm instantly reminded me of Daniel. Daniel was an advisor to the king. He submitted to his ruling authorities. So did Joseph, right? He was the right hand of the Pharaoh. At the moment, I have not explored this to an extent that satisfies me, so I won't go into it in this video, but I did want to make a note for future reference. The last thing that I wanted to flesh out in this video is just at Esther's introduction. I was really moved when I was reading, and I wrote a sticky note at the end of the study, which you will likely see at the end of this video. I wrote that what Esther went through was not easy. The events between chapter 1 and chapter 2 take place in a span of 4 years, and it must have been so hard. Here's some things that I kind of listed for myself. The story takes place after Judah's exile, right, the southern kingdom. They get conquered, and Esther, like all the other Jews in the story, is in exile, right? She's lost her home. And then the story tells us that Esther had lost both of her parents, right? So one, her home, two, her parents. And I can't begin to imagine that sort of grief. Esther is then put in the care of Mordecai, her cousin, and he couldn't have been that much older, according to the scholars. And then a third thing, we're told that she has a Jewish name, Hadassah, and she goes by a Persian name, Esther, right? So she does that to probably assimilate to the Persian culture. So you could say that she lost her name. Then we hear about what happens with Queen Vashti in chapter 1, and suddenly all these women are being taken to be part of the king's harem. Scholars think that Mordecai might have hidden Esther as long as possible until he no longer could. One commentary described being a part of the king's harem as incredibly isolating. Women could not leave, they could not speak freely, and the only way to communicate with the outside world was through eunuchs and certain officials that were allowed in the king's inner court, right? It was like a section of the palace, like in the innermost part of the palace, that not everybody had access to. To keep track. She lost her home, she lost her parents, she lost her name, and then she loses her cousin Mordecai, like the last of her family. Another scholar pointed out that she lost the chance to have companionship that is found in marriage. As soon as you were brought into the king's harem, you were considered married to the king, right? So then that opportunity is lost. And then last but not least, she really had to hide her whole identity. So she couldn't practice kosher, she couldn't practice her faith, her culture. If you can see what I've done here, there's a lot of loss happening here. And I was meditating on it, and I couldn't help but feel so sad for her. It's very tragic. And yet, interwoven into the story is the repetition of a single phrase. Chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. It says, "So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the woman. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And then we see that again in verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the woman, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her." And then last, verse 17, "The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." So here's some fun things that I was thinking about when thinking about this phrase, winning favor, won grace and favor. One is, in Hebrew, is nasa, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, nasa. It can be translated as received and gained. So she receives favor, she gains favor. And I thought that that was really interesting because I was really thinking about all that she's lost. And yeah, it says she gained favor. The two words that are used here for favor and grace are hesed and hen. There are a few differences that I was meditating on. Again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'll try to be as accurate as possible. I noticed that the first time she won favor, it's the eunuchs, right? The sense would be that she won a favorable attitude from him. It's more specifically the word chesed here is a very complex word. Check out the Bible Project. They go into detail about it. It can be fair to say that she won like his kindness. She won his loyalty. What I notice here from the second and the third references is that there's like this reciprocal nature to Hesed. She won their favor, but then it says in the eyes, in his sight. So Esther is seen by others, and then they feel Hesed towards her. So what exactly is seen? I'm inclined to conclude that they see Esther's own Hesed. Despite everything she went through, she must have embodied loving kindness, loyalty, beauty, grace, etc. Ultimately, Hesed overflows from God, even though in the Bible, Israel wasn't loyal to God, and sometimes neither are we. And again, watch the Bible Project for all that. God is unchanging, and his Hesed is forever, and we should strive to be like him. And I think Esther did that in her story. And then maybe also, God softened some hearts, and how he works is a mystery to us, but it is by his providence that she was able to stay safe. Not to mention that Esther's cousin, Mordecai, was one of the king's officials, so she wasn't completely cut off from him, which again is another evidence of God's providence, because so many women would not be able to contact their families after being a part of the king's harem. Anyways, I hope that everything I said made sense. That's what I've been meditating on, and many blessings.